just think God's love, man, it's all around us. We just have to look for it and we can see it. And I think that's how I've been able to experience it. And I really think because of that, I understand so much better now. Oh, yeah, I do have this relationship with God. It is not just a God who's way out there and I'm here, or a God who's authoritarian or scary or distant, but it's actually a God who's like right there with us. And I think about that a lot, especially with the kids that I work with and the kids who question a lot, like, is God real? And if I dig a little deeper, I'm like, oh, you know what? They haven't really experienced like the tangibleness of God because they haven't really experienced the love of God through relationships and with people. And I don't know, I hope that we could change that. Hi, my name is Phyllis, and I'm a huge BTS fan and also a pastor in the greater Boston area. And this is my faithy story.
So I begin every podcast by asking, could you share how your faith journey started?
Yeah. So my faith journey started when I want to say when I was a baby, because my parents, before they immigrated to the United States independently, they both were had become Christians in Korea, and then when they came over after they got married, they started attending it. My faith journey started as a baby, where I had my 100-day celebration at the church, and didn't I feel like I didn't own my own faith journey probably until I was in ninth grade when I was at a high school retreat and just really felt like God had always been kind of nudging me, I think, and calling me. And I kind of was like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think it just didn't click until I was maybe in ninth grade that I needed to kind of take my own action for it. That I couldn't just let it be my parents' faith, but I actually had to take ownership of it. And so I would say ninth grade is kind of when, I really dove deep into the Bible, and I had a spiritual mentor who came to my house every week, and we just prayed and dug into the Bible, memorized scripture and kind of all this stuff, and helped me to grow so much and kind of give me a really solid foundation.
So I have a question because a lot of people have been sharing that that retreat experience in youth group has
Hmm.
been kind of like the beginning point or launching point. And that's kind of also my story too, but I guess for me, I never really struggled like if God was real or not. I just like assumed just because I grew up in the church like you. So
Yeah.
like my mom started going to church when she found out she was pregnant with me.
Hmm.
So I was just immersed in it. But for you, like, was there any like doubt that God existed, or it was just kind of assumed?
There was any doubt that God existed. I knew that God was always there. I think for me, what was that tipping point was I was just having a really hard time in ninth grade. And I think for me, there was a sense that maybe if I clung on to God for myself and not through kind of my parents, that I would experience something different, something more tangible of God, even though I knew God existed and God was always there. And so there wasn't like a big question. No one had to convince me to believe, but I think I just felt like if I make this step, will something change and be different about my life in a more tangible and real way than it has been so far.
So what were you struggling with in ninth grade?
I was struggling with depression. And I think when I look back on it now, I'm like, oh, yeah, I was really depressed. And I think it's, a lot of teenagers kind of go through their own kind of mental health, I think, crisis at some point. And I think I had this real standard of having to be perfect and feeling like I had to be perfect and just realizing that I was not going to be perfect and that I make mistakes and that I couldn't, it was really hard living up to other people's expectations. And, we had some other family things kind of going on too. And so all of those kind of combined, and I was just feeling really depressed and really unsure about whether life was worth living, or I don't know, kind of just feeling really sad about the way that things were kind of, I think, unraveling in my own high school world and in my family and things like that. And so I don't know if I was necessarily looking for God to like rescue me from that, but I think I wanted some answers. And I remember a lot of times just crying out to God and saying, why? Um, and there's no answer, obviously, that was coming, like no audible voice, but I just felt God's presence in that. And I think that's what kind of helped me to kind of really hold it together for my time in high school.
Sorry, I'm in a booth.
Yeah, no, I get that. At our church, we have lights that turn off automatically in our elementary room. And so sometimes when the kids are being really still, the lights will just shut off. And it's hilarious because the kids are like, oh my gosh, what just happened? And I was like, you guys are being so still. You didn't even move a muscle.
I'm
So
leaving that in.
it was just hilarious. And I was like, what was so interesting? It was Jesus, wasn't it? So anyway, they're just like, oh.
So how did that start improving after ninth grade?
Well, I give a lot of credit to my spiritual mentor, Sydney, and she came to my house every week, and we lived far from our church. So growing up in the Pacific Northwest, there were like pockets of, I guess, like Korean churches, and a lot of them were actually north of Seattle. And we went to this Korean immigrant church that my parents were going to in Chicago, and then that pastor had moved from Chicago to Seattle. And so we just started going there. But because of where my dad was working, we happened to live like south of Seattle. So it took us an hour to get to church. So Sydney would drive an hour every weekend, yeah, down to my house. And we would just spend hours like talking and reading the Bible. We went through this like huge like discipleship workbook. And then she would often just hang around for dinner and just hang out with our family. And then she would drive back up. And so she did this, I want to say she did this for a couple years, and it was like every Saturday. And I think that helped me to understand better about who God was, what it meant to, I think, live a life that was surrounded by God and in God's presence, and to just give me some hope in a way that I think I didn't know I could have in God. Because they don't really teach you that when you're sitting at church or in Sunday school, at least not in my immigrant church experience. They don't tell you that. And I think she kind of brought it at a more real level, and I could really open up to her and talk to her about just kind of the difficulties that I might have been having in school, friendships, and all the kind of typical things that a high schooler would be going through. And she was able to, I think, really direct me and show me how God gives us hope. And I think I always had an idea of that, but I think it just became more real and concrete when Sydney, we'd have these conversations together, and I don't know, we'd just read the Bible together. And I was like, oh, wow, there's a lot of stuff in here. And then when she would just pray for me. And to me, seeing an adult who was actively pursuing God and living out their faith was really remarkable to me, because it was so different from the way that my parents displayed their faith. And it was, yeah, it was just a really different experience. And I was like, oh, this could be for me too. And there must be something to the fact that all these people cling on to God and have hope in God. And I think for myself, I just experienced it numerous times where I was like, oh man, if it weren't for God, I just don't know how I could get through life. And so, yeah, I feel like that's kind of what changed and what made it really real for me.
How did you take that? And then actually, let me rewind. In college, did you continue to grow or did it come down? Because I shouldn't assume, but yeah.
Yeah, no, it did. I went, I had a lot of people praying for me when I went to college. And I don't know if it's because they thought I was really kind of naive. And so they thought, wow, she needs a lot of prayer. But I joined a church that was not too far from our campus and was really invested. And I look back on it now and I'm like, well, it might not be the kind of place that I would have chosen now, but at the time, it was really good. We had small groups, we had Bible teaching, and um, we had a pastor that was specific to our campus, and we had a community that we were building. And I think I learned a lot about God in certain ways while I was there in college, and I grew a lot, and I just felt a greater sense of God's calling in my life, even though I didn't see the possibility of it. but I felt a greater sense of that in college. And I think that's what really kept me going back, to this church in particular and to growing there and just trying to figure out like what is my faith really about? What exactly do I really believe? And I think college was definitely a time that it challenged and brought up those questions. And it was really eye-opening when I look back on it because I was like, oh wow, that was always kind of there. So yeah, I it was difficult when I look back on it, but it was such a good and rich time as well. And I learned so much. And I think I'm really thankful and grateful for that opportunity just to have grown so much in Christ because of my time in college.
Would you go to undergrad?
I went to Bryn Mawr College out in Pennsylvania.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
I served at Antioch in
Oh, yeah.
Conshohocken.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So, what was it about the church that like you feel like now you wouldn't go back, or it's not the type of church that?
Yeah, I think a lot about what was so great about a Korean immigrant church experience and an English ministry that's attached to that. And then also, like on the flip side, what's not so great about it. And, I think there was a lot of spiritual abuse also and manipulation. And I don't know, it's just interesting the way that certain things were kind of taught. And I learned a lot about having to repent and what it meant to be a sinner, but didn't really get much of God's love and grace on the other side. And so it was kind of a skewed look, I think, at God. And at the time, also when I was in college, and this probably dates me, but evangelism was like really huge. We used like four spiritual laws, like, you hand out booklets, and there was like a particular way you evangelize. And I look back on that and I was like, wow, that would not work today. And that is definitely not something that I would I would say, oh, for our youth group kids or college students or whatever, be like, hey, let's do this. But it was the time where it was okay to do that. And I still learned a lot. And I was just like, okay, like I was able to articulate my faith in this particular way. And I used that and I was able to do that. But I also learned a lot about like what it meant to be like legalistic about your faith too, and why that might not be so great. And why that could be, harmful as well. So yeah, I think there's like a balance, and I think I got too much of one side and not enough of kind of the other aspect.
Do you mind giving some details about what you mean by spiritual abuse based on your experience, just so that people like listening could understand, like, oh wait, this is not okay.
Yeah. So, I had a lot of eyes on me during college. So whatever I did, people seemed to just know. And somebody was clearly like reporting my activities. And I was always surprised. Not because I was trying to hide anything, but it was really interesting that kind of our pastors and some of the leaders would just come up to me and say, hey, I heard like XYZ was happening. And I'm just like, how would you even know that? Like, are you in my dorm? Like, what's going on here? Are you following me? So I think it started out kind of like that. And then it was really about, well, you can't see this friend because they're not Christian or they're not a part of our fellowship. And you can't hang out with this person because of these other reasons, and kind of limiting like who I can hang out with, what activities I could be involved in. And then if I ever did anything that kind of they didn't like or they kind of frowned upon, it was, this is like of Satan. And so you need to be prayed for. And they would, like they would pound on your back and pray for you. I don't know if it was like an exorcism, but like they were trying to get Satan out of you because you clearly were doing what Satan was doing. Um, but yeah, it was just really restrictive of who you could hang out with, what you could be doing, and a lot of also, you should take these classes because this is what you should be doing. And there was a hard and fast, like, no dating rule. And if you are dating, it was really, you're kind of kicked out of everything. And also, like, what you wore. People would say that's not modest. You need to change, like, the type of shirt you're wearing or, like, whatnot. And so, I felt like all of those kinds of things were manipulative and controlling, and probably not really healthy. But I think for me, the hardest part was when I was feeling depressed and I really needed to like see a therapist and be on medication. The response from the church really was actually, there's some sort of sin that you're not repenting of that is causing this, and you need to repent more, and you need to pray, more, and it's Satan is causing this. And do you really want to be with crazy people seeing a therapist? Like, you actually should just, talk with the pastor, and just kind of those kinds of things. And I think I could have benefited from therapy. I could have benefited from medication at that time, um, if it hadn't been for the church. And I look at that and I'm just like, man, that just is wrong. And that's not right. Like, you can have a belief, but you can also have room, um, I think, to let people get the professional help that they need, in addition to praying for them, right? In addition to, like, yeah, taking an honest look at your life as well. Like, I don't see anything wrong with that part. But when you're saying you can only do this, this is the only way you can be healed, I think it just gets kind of problematic. So it was just kind of things like that that I look back on and I'm like, man, I wish I made different choices, and I wish I was able to kind of stand up to that. But, part of it is, as you're growing as a Christian, you want the favor of God, and you just feel like, if I could just please these pastors who are like in direct line with God, then God will be happy with me too. Because they're always saying to me how God is just unhappy with who we are, right? Because it's like, you're such a sinner. Like, you should be so thankful that Jesus even died for, and then I think it gets kind of twisted in your head that you're just like, oh man, like, if I can't even make these pastors happy, how am I going to ever make God, who's perfect, happy? And it just kind of gets twisted, and I think jumbled, and then you're really striving hard to please these authority figures as a college student, and you kind of do whatever they tell you to do, and you're just like, if I could just do this, like, God will be happy with me, like, I'll be living right with God and in the will of God. And I think sometimes that gets really confused.
So, what's the good that you got out of it that made you kind of solidify what you know and what you believe?
Yeah, I mean, I think I learned a lot about God. Like, I gained a lot of knowledge about God. And I think that's more so than an average college student would have gained knowledge about God. Like, I was reading, for our membership classes, we had to read like systematic theology, and it's like crazy. I was like, 18, 19 years old, and I have like this huge systematic theology book and reading all these other like theology books. And I'm just like, whatever you guys give me, I'm reading, and, reading like Bible study commentaries and all this stuff. And I'm just like, I was just like packed to the gills with knowledge. And it was great. It was really helpful. And I really read a lot of the Bible, like, just so much. And I'm really thankful for that, because I think it's helped me to get a solid foundation, especially when I think now, as I work with children and youth and families now, who the Bible is just not in kind of their regular reading or knowledge base, right? Where it was 20, 30 years ago, even a non-Christian would know basic Bible stories, but now it's not like that. And so I just really appreciate that, especially when it comes to like sermon writing. And I'm like, oh yeah, like, remember that. And when I look back, and reading the Bible and looking at kind of verses and things like that, like, that has just been really helpful to me. And I'm so thankful for that. So yeah, I feel like I gained a lot of knowledge, and knowledge is not a bad thing. And then I feel like, post college for me, a lot of it was experience and understanding the heart of God. And I think you need all those things, right? Just because we're human beings and we have all those different sides. And so we need all those things. Um, and I think the same thing with like what we need to know about God. It's not just head knowledge, but it's also that heart knowledge too. So,
Was your pastor from Westminster?
uh, actually, yeah, one of them was, and a bunch of them went to biblical also. So it was, yeah, and it was just like uber conservative. And I would say I am not that conservative in terms of like theological leanings and thinking. So It's very interesting. I mean, that church didn't allow women to be pastors, and neither did my church growing up. So, like, I just feel like every time in my mere existence is like a big defiance. So that's why I'm just like, I don't think I would go back there again because I think I wouldn't be able to exist in what I do now, simply because that was not, and it's still not, I think, acceptable.
Yeah, I mean, I went to Westminster, and so like I know the culture around the Philly area.
Yeah.
So are you currently on medication and going to therapy?
I'm going to therapy, but I have not been on medication probably for, I want to say, like over 20 years. Yeah.
How did the medication help you? Primarily because a lot of people have a stigma, like with drugs.
Yeah,
But
yeah. No, medication is great. I learned a lot about when you have depression and when you have anxiety, kind of the things that happens with your brain chemicals. And when it's just like repeated, it's really hard for those brain chemicals to kind of get going again. And so the medication helps to do that. And it was so helpful for me just to kind of get to the place where I felt like I can talk about this and not completely shut down. Because that's the place where I was, where if you're constantly in that state of depression and you're constantly kind of in that shutdown phase where you're just, I think it's like called the like polyvagal system, and you're just always kind of in that shutdown place, it's really hard to do anything. And it's really hard to kind of, I think, even with therapy, get the help that you need. But medication just helps you to kind of get out of that place a little bit so that you can do the work that needs to be done in order to help yourself. Like, I don't think medication alone is can do, it's not a miracle, like it's not like a miracle cure. Like you have the medication, but you also gotta do the therapy, and it has to kind of work in conjunction together along with, you know, nutrition and all this other stuff that has come out now. Just, the research on mental health and stuff has just increased. Like, it just boggles my mind what they know now that they didn't know 20, 30 years ago. And I'm like, man, I could have benefited so much from all that knowledge. And so, yeah, I always encourage folks, like, if sometimes you're in a place where you can't kind of get past that next level, and sometimes that medication, it just helps. And it's not a bad thing, and it you're not necessarily going to stay on it for the rest of your life. Like, it just, kind of depending on what your mental illness is and things like that. But like, it's another helpful tool. Um, and I think it's better just to think of it that way. And I think there's a lot of stigma around it because people don't understand how medication works. That, oh, it's going to make you lazy. At least that's what a lot of like Korean Americans that I know will say. It's going to make you lazy. It's just going to make you sleepy and sleep all day. And I'm just like, yeah, but you know what? Like, your depression and anxiety, it like paralyzes, it makes you do the same thing. So sometimes there's certain medications that work better than others, depending on who you are. And, it's a trial by error kind of thing. And like, you got to try one thing and then kind of see that and under a doctor's care. And it can be really helpful. And so I'm just like, let's break the stigma. It's like if you have a headache and you take Advil or Tylenol, right? Or if you have high blood pressure, you take medication for that. Same thing, same idea.
Yeah, I'm realizing more and more everyone's really different, like biologically and
Yeah,
neurochemically,
yeah.
that we have to just figure out what works for us. Even in our
Mhm,
diet, like there's so
mhm.
many diet fads that I like because I've been like obsessed about getting lean. But like at the
Yeah,
end of the day, you need to figure out like what works for your body and then move forward from there.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
so for you, like what have you been learning in therapy? And like for you, how is therapy different than like counseling?
Yeah, you mean like pastoral counseling? Yeah. So, what I've been learning about therapy is that there is a lot of stuff even from my childhood that I have to mend from. And I love my parents, and they did the best that they could with the tools that they had. And so I don't fault them, and I don't like sit there and blame them like, oh man, they were terrible parents. Because that's not actually really true. But they had limited tools. Like my dad, he was orphaned when he was 5, and he never grew up really with any parents. So there was no real model for him of what it meant to be a dad. And, my mom, to some degree, it was just a different time where she was growing up. And the way that parents related with kids was really different. And so you're asking these two people who grew up in this really different time in this different country to come and parent in this brand new country. And so, of course, they're going to get a whole bunch of things wrong. And I'm just like, well, that's what therapy's for. And I have the same attitude with my kid. Like, I may think I'm an awesome parent and I'm doing such a great job, but I can 100% guarantee you that my kid is probably talking to their therapist about the ways that I've screwed up. And I'm like, I'm okay with that, but we're getting a little bit better, each generation, right? Because we're really trying not to translate and continue to pass on the generational traumas and like the like maladjusted ways that we kind of parent and things like that. Because we're just human beings who are fallible. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of that. And a lot of like who I am today has a lot to do with the kind of messages and the things that I was reflected back when I was a kid. And that just kind of gets ingrained in you and you don't even think about it. And so for me right now, I have sticky notes all over my computer and, on my journal and stuff that says I am enough. And I need that because that was something that I just didn't get enough of when I was a kid. And part of that is because I'm an oldest child. Part of that is because I grew up in a, Korean immigrant household. And it's kind of like you have to keep doing and achieving, right? And you're trying to live out the dreams of not just your parents, but like all these other people who are in this like faraway country are counting on you to like become something big because they gave up so much just so that I could be here, right? And that's a lot of pressure. And you're just like, I just have to keep on achieving. And part of my personality is, well, if I don't achieve and if I don't overachieve, right? Like, what am I? What am I really doing? And that's just a part of who I am. And I'm trying to like really break that down because I think it's led to overworking, unbalanced like family work life, like all these other things that I need to work on. And for me to be, I think, an effective pastor, I need to work on these things for myself so that it doesn't spill into my pastoring. And so those are the kinds of things I'm learning right now in therapy. And I love a good therapist because they are professionally trained to understand and handle those kinds of things and help you work through all of that. So, especially kind of like, I think the different like traumas and the ways of healing, where pastoral counseling, I'll just, and you probably understand this because you went to seminary. If you get like one class of pastoral counseling in seminary, you're pretty lucky. And that's been my experience too. And I'm just like, you know what? That's not the same as going to a therapist who has to professionally train at school and then do a certain set amount of hours, thousands of hours of supervised training. And then there's me, who's got my Old Testament, my New Testament theology, and my Bible exegesis and my Greek, and then my one class of pastoral counseling. And I go in there and there's a crisis that's happening. And man, I know how to handle that crisis. But after that, like my job really in pastoral counseling is to say, okay, it looks like these are the things that you need. These are the people that can kind of help carry you and to help you fill those needs. Because as a pastor, pastoral counseling is not about therapy and it's not about, guiding that process in that way, in that therapeutic way. I think pastoral counseling really is the triage and helping people to get connected to the right resources so that they can have that and work that out. And I'm not a savior. Like, not that any therapist is either, but I think pastors often get into the trap that I have to save this person or I have to heal this person. And that's actually not our job. And, God is the one who's the healer and God is the one who's doing that. But that person themselves, they need to want to have that healing as well. And I just like when I look at myself as a pastoral counselor, my role is really just to kind of help to facilitate and then to make sure that they're going in that they're getting the right resources and walking in that right direction, that path to go to get that to that healing. But I'm not actually going to be doing any of that. And I think that's like the big difference between a therapist and a pastoral counselor. Like there isn't going to be that kind of therapeutic ongoing relationship.
Yeah, I like how you said it's like triage, and then you kind of like making sure they're not bleeding, and then you hand them off.
Yeah.
I think for even for therapists, it's not just the tools they have, but they also just have a very different perspective, and they can be a
Hmm.
lot more objective too. So I feel
Oh
like
yeah.
that's helpful.
Yeah.
So for you, like, how did you start learning about like the love of God and God's heart and like more of like I don't want to say spiritual, but there is this like relational,
Hmm.
ethereal presence.
Yeah. I think I learned about that through my friendships. And I have to say, even I have this one friend in college, and she's still my best friend now. And she displayed an unconditional love that I think friend wise, I don't know if I necessarily experienced that. And that was pretty cool. And it still continues to this day, which is pretty impressive because now it's been over 25 years since we first met. And I think it's through that, and it's also through, I think, the healing that has happened with my family, with like especially with my mom. And I also think it's when I heard about it from the pulpit at a church. And I remember like when I moved to Boston, I remember sitting at this church, and the pastor was preaching about God's love, and I just started weeping. Because that was the first time that I felt like, oh my gosh, I felt like that message was for me. Like I just felt like God was saying, actually, you know what, Phyllis, I love you. And I'm telling you this right now. It's through this person, but I'm telling you right now. And I remember just weeping, um and from then on, like just experiencing different relationships and friendships with people that just reiterated and really emphasized God's love and God's grace. And I have some really amazing friends here in Boston and that have just displayed that continuously. And we've had our ups and downs, but I don't know, it's just so unique. And I don't know if I can ever find that again because I think it was really unique and it's just a few set of people. And I love walking life with them because they are the constant reminders. Like when my dad died 5 years ago, three of them jumped on an airplane and flew all the way out to Seattle, literally for 24 hours to be there for me. And I was just floored by that because I didn't think friendship could be like that. And that was just so moving to me. And so I just feel like it's all these little things now that I've been able to experience God's love. And I have to say, it's also through my kid. I'm not saying that everyone needs to be a parent to experience that, but man, if there's a kid in your life that you can love and that they love you, there's something special about that. It doesn't have to be your own kid. This is why everyone should go and volunteer for their children's ministry and youth ministry. Because man, that it just kind of opens your world in this way where, man, this kid is just accepting you just exactly the way that you are with your flaws and all. And then when they get older and they know that you're flawed, they still love you anyway. And that's pretty amazing because that's God and that's God's love. And I also think, if you don't have kids, go find a pet. I am 1000% convinced that dogs, especially, if you're a cat person or whatever, like that's fine. But dogs, especially, every time I open the door when I come home, my dog is waiting there for me. And I'm just like, wow, why are you so happy to see me? And I'm so glad. And it's just unconditional. And you could, and like we have a rescue dog, and I don't know what happened in her life before, but she has a lot of fears and things like that, but she still loves people so much. And it's kind of like no matter what harm has come their way and no matter what kind of abuse they still love human beings, even though they're the perpetrators, right, of hurt, but they will still love them. And I just see that in my dog, and I'm just like so amazed that they could be that loving. So, yeah, I just think God's love, man, it's all around us. We just have to look for it and we can see it. And I think that's how I've been able to experience it. And I really think because of that, I understand so much better now. Oh, yeah, I do have this relationship with God. It is not just a God who's way out there and I'm here, or a God who's authoritarian or scary or distant, but it's actually a God who's like right there with us. And I think about that a lot, especially with the kids that I work with and the kids who question a lot, like, is God real? And if I dig a little deeper, I'm like, oh, you know what? They haven't really experienced like the tangibleness of God because they haven't really experienced the love of God through relationships and with people. And I don't know, I hope that we could change that.
So, what are you doing now, and how does all those experiences kind of play out in you being a pastor?
Yeah, so I work as a pastor and I work a lot with children, youth, and family right now in right outside of Boston and at a church. And I think those are my motivations of why I want to work, especially with the children, youth, and family. Because I realize, I'm closer to 50 than the other end, and I'm like, man, I've been doing so much work to try to undo all of that. And it got me thinking, if someone had come into my life when I was younger, elementary, high school, even like a 20-year-old, right? And helped me and kind of like helped me to have a good foundation of who I am, understanding who I am, understanding like of God and how God loves me and how God has created me. I feel like I would be in a really different place. And I think about that a lot with our kids. And I'm just like, that's what I want to do is I really want to help kids to be able to be in that place already so that their flourishing can start earlier and that their flourishing can progress in the ways that it was meant to progress, I think, for their lives. Like we're supposed to leave things better. It's like my parents, thank goodness that they moved at the time that they moved and they struggled a lot for my flourishing. And I am where I am because of that sacrifice. And I'm just like, well, if I can kind of help that they're not deconstructing their entire lives at the age of 40, but sooner, then what world changing could happen if these kids are doing that, right? Because they're already changing our world. Like Gen Z, Gen Alpha, they're already like, they're just different and they're so unique and they're so amazing. But it's like, we don't let them because we're just like, well, they're just kids. What do they know? But man, if we could empower them and we could give them the tools and just say, yes, like reflect back, you are the image of God. You are loved and you are whole beings. Go and do exactly what God has called you to do. Like you're going to get amazing presidents, world leaders, innovation, like we're going to save the earth for real. And I think that has been really my drive and my motivation. And I just feel like somebody asked me like, what would you be doing now if like that was reflected back to you when you were younger? And I just said, I would have been president of the United States. And people laugh, but I'm like, no, I'm serious. Like, I think God really created me to be someone who rocks the boat, but that has really gotten kind of pushed out of me because you're not supposed to do that as an Asian American, especially as a Asian American woman. You shouldn't rock the boat. Keep your head down and like keep going. But I'm just like, you know what? I was created to rock the boat, so that's what I'm gonna do. And if I can rock the boat for some of the kids that I work with and the kids that are in my life, then I just feel like I've done exactly what God has called me to do and the invitation that God has given to me. And so, yeah, so I hope to keep on doing that. That's what I'm doing right now. And I hope that we're going to see a lot of kids kind of in their flourishing and just kind of seeing exciting things happen because of that.
I totally agree with you. I think, in an odd way, Gen Z and the new generation, because they value authenticity and
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
honesty a lot, and I think that a lot of that has to do with like our generation of trying to like conforming and like being
Hmm.
so like in the box that they're
Hmm.
like throw away the box. And more I'm realizing, as long as you are like your authentic self and the way God
Hmm.
made you, like that's the call. I
Yeah.
used to think a call is like, oh, I got to do this and do
Yes.
this, but it's like, no, I got to be this person,
Yep.
because in that situation, where whatever situation I'm in, I need to be that person,
Yep.
obviously in a Christ loving way. And that is what God's going to do and accomplish, not
Yep.
by necessarily doing. So, yeah, I totally agree. how have you been dealing with like the stigma of being a female pastor, and
Mhm.
like what are your theological convictions around that role with the opposition saying otherwise?
Yeah, so the denomination that I'm in right now passed a resolution in the 70s to ordain women. And it was not really argued upon because they were busy actually arguing about like divorce and like what the policy would be around that. And I stumbled into this denomination. And so for me, for a long time, I just thought I felt a call for vocational ministry. I know it's weird to say that, but I really did. Like when I was a little kid, I was just like, my job, my future job is going to be to work for God. And I didn't really understand what that meant. Like other kids were like, I'm going to be a doctor, I'm going to be like a trash truck driver or whatever. And I was just literally like, I'm going to go work for God. And I think I didn't really understand what that meant until I was obviously much older, but I never saw that around me. So I was like, well, that's out of the question. So I was like, well, maybe I'll go and be missionary because it seems like they allow women to go and be missionaries, right? You can do ministry in foreign lands. It's okay. And that's just what I thought. And it wasn't until I was in my, mid to late 20s that I first saw a woman preaching. And then I was like, wait, I could do this? Like that could be me? I had no idea. And even then I was like, well, I don't know if that's actually what God's calling me because I think that was like a childhood thing. It's like it was kind of like nonsense. But I kept feeling that tug and when it came time something opened up, I just was like, I'm going to do this. And I put myself out there and then I just kind of was like people were affirming it left and right and just kind of like this makes a lot of sense. Like even my own husband was like this makes a lot of sense. This was your path. And so I did some digging in the Bible, and our denomination also gave some resources about women in ministry and in leadership. And in the very beginning of Genesis where it talks about how like God creates Eve and then the translation is helper. And I learned, and this is where I was like, oh, this knowledge is very handy. I learned that the word that's not an accurate translation. And the word is azer, right? And it's a partner. And and then in seminary, I just learned, I was like, oh, there's all these women who were helping Paul and doing ministry. And I was like, what? How come nobody ever talks about this? How come this isn't like prominent in the Bible? Right. And there's all these other scriptures that lead people to say, oh, this is why women shouldn't be in ministry. And I've like poured through them, like the Greek translation, right? Like all of that. And I've just really come to the conclusion that you can believe that if you want, but I really think God created us as equals, as partners in ministry. And because of that, women should be pastors, women should be leaders, women should be leading in ministry. And in addition to that, I also think that if you're not in agreement with that and you choose to be complementarian, your job is still to advocate for women because they are also part of the image of God. We often think that the image of God is this individual thing, that we each have been created. But that's actually a misinterpretation of scripture also. It is we collectively have been made in the image of God. So then women have to be a part of that because we all have been created in that image. So you can't have 50% and say, oh, we're reflecting the image of God because that's only 50. You only got half. You need women. So even if you're complementarian, I'm like, your job is still, your call is still to advocate for women and to help women discover their voice, have their voice, and to honor them in that way. I think a lot of times we have these attitudes about women that especially in the church and if you look at the history like and I was looking into the Evangelical Covenant Church history, which is my denomination, all the things that women were doing. And I wrote a paper on that and I was just like, why do we never tell these stories? These are what the women were. They were funding missionaries. They were sewing things and selling it so that they could get money to fund missionary doctors to go overseas. They were raising money to renew the dorms for the seminary. And all they were doing all these things. And I'm like, they're actually doing the work also. It's just the men are the ones that are preaching and are saying the words, but it's the women who are doing all that work. And I was like, there's a place. And so whether you believe, whether you're complementarian or egalitarian, whatever it is that you might believe, we still have an obligation to uphold and honor and to advocate for women, regardless of what our core like theological leaning and belief is. And it's hard because there are a lot of churches, even within our denomination, that they're like, yeah, we believe in, women in ministry, but they don't reflect that in their action. And I'm like, well, yeah, we're not perfect. We're human beings and we kind of believe what we believe. But I just feel like, we have room for that. But at the same time, what are you doing to kind of help? And then I think about all the like little girls who are looking and who they see up there. And I'm just like, you know what? If you keep thinking that, because God is not a man, right? Or a woman, right? God doesn't have gender. But if you only say that and you always reference God in the he, and you're only putting up pastors who are male, I just feel like that little girl who one day becomes a woman is going to be like, is God even for me? I mean, I'm hoping that there'll be other instances in her life where she will experience that, but you're not setting them up to see God in themselves. And I just feel like that's important. And it's a part of us reflecting the image of God as God's people, and that we have to do that together. So I don't know if I answered your question.
No, you did. I mean, there's a lot there to kind of unpack. Maybe I'll unpack a couple of things. One, I totally agree with you. Like when he created humanity, like Adam, right, male and female.
Yeah.
So, secondly, the reason why we use the pronoun he is because of the relational aspect of Father,
Yeah.
Son, and Spirit. No, it's also just for the audience. Like I don't know who's listening to this.
Yeah.
And then lastly, I'm coming around more and more. Like I'm a staunch complementarian, but not in like the conventional sense, but more that like I really do believe God placed a responsibility on men. And the reason why we have all our problems is just because men are not stepping up and being Christ-like. But as to the female pastoral thing, like when I read scripture, like Paul, well, again, my interpretation is Paul's only problem was like women having authority over men. And so if you can, because I'm still like working that out, but if you could somehow work that out, yeah, I totally believe like we need to have sisters in ministry in the fullest capacity. Do you know what I mean?
Maybe I think I know what you mean. I don't think women pastors should ever try to be a male figurehead because that's not
Yeah,
true to who they're going to be.
yeah,
And the way that they lead is going to be really different from the way that men. Although I do have to say, as a woman who's in leadership, I think there is an expectation that for us to lead in that way, but then there's a lot of criticism that comes because if a male leads in one way, it looks like this, but if a female leads in that same way, then she's kind of looked down upon, or she's kind of this like hard, like it just comes off like in a negative light in a way that it doesn't for a man. I think a woman leading has they have to lead the way that they were created to lead. Just like same thing with men. Like I don't think that men should ever like emulate somebody else because then that's not really authentic to them. And that's going to end up causing them a lot of problems down the road because they were never being their true self. And if you're not your true self, it's really hard to be vulnerable. It's really hard to be authentic. It's really hard. Like, right? You just start building all these secrets, and then that's kind of when you get into trouble. I I think it's okay. I don't know. I don't know, Danny. I think like it's okay for women to like be lead pastors and stuff. I just think I think we think pastors are the ultimate authority, but actually it's our board of elders or our leadership team. Like that's actually who has well in the congregational churches, right? And I'm part of congregational denomination. And so my boss is not my lead pastor. My boss is actually the congregation. And in it is mixed men and women who are a part of that leadership team. And it's that collective leadership that I look to as kind of my authority. Yeah, I don't know. It's a hard one. It's really tricky because I just think men and women lead in different ways. But you can't just only have one and not the other. I think there's a reason why there's a partnership, just like that's why it's important to have diversity of thinking, ethnicities, and that as well. Like that is what makes that full image, and you can't only just operate with just one part.
No, I totally agree with you. I think it needs to start with partnership. When I say equality, I don't mean like equal in roles, because even
Mhm.
in men, like in a team, everyone can't be a quarterback. I don't think
Yeah,
people understand, right?
yeah,
So there is distinctions in roles, but like we are equal in value, and like yeah, so it starts with partnership, but there has to be a framework where I believe like men need male role models and female needs female role models, right? But also like men need to know how to like have like a feminine heart where we are like vulnerable and honest, but also women have to like have a masculine mind where you're like logical and you just can't feel everything. So and I see that in a family dynamic. You know, no one says like a single parent home is like the best thing. It's like that's the worst thing, right? So yeah, and the church should be modeling the family structure, and I think we've kind of lost that because well, my theory is like we've just kind of like started following like what how the world does it, where there's only like one leader and you follow one leader, but like you see in Old Testament times when you have one king, things fall apart. It's not
yeah.
supposed to be that way. So
I what I've been lately, I think, thinking a lot about is leadership structure and how it should actually be flat and not hierarchical.
completely agree with
And
you.
yeah, and that there is a great benefit in that. And so when you have a team of people who are leading together, it's always going to be better than just one person. And I think a lot about the current team that I'm a part of, the pastoral team that I'm a part of. And so there's 3 men and 2 women. And even though we have given the title to one person to be the lead pastor, there really is a flatness to the structure where we come together to make decisions, where we confer together, and yet we still have our distinct individual voices and obviously
Yeah.
roles that we play, right? And I have really enjoyed that. And I have seen, I feel like our team and our church grow more because of that, instead of kind of this everyone looking to the one person to make decisions about things. And I have seen that model play out where people just kind of get stuck. And if that person cannot keep moving forward, then the church just kind of stays at like a stalemate, or they just kind of plateau. And it's really hard to keep moving further. And I just think I've been really lucky to be a part of this staff where everyone kind of believes in that flat structure. And so we've been making a lot of strides in ways that I didn't even expect when I first came onto the staff in progressing forward, in allowing our church, I think, to grow and to be different and to be more experimental, I guess. To like, there's more of a willingness to try things. And if it fails, we're just kind of like, it's not a big deal. And then we just kind of try something different. And I think that's the innovation that needs to happen at church, because the way that we've been doing church for all these years, right, hundreds of years, it's like, it's not, that's not going to be church of the future. And so we need a pivot. We need to make a change. But if we continue with that model of leadership where there's just one person that everyone kind of looks to, then I think that's where things kind of start falling apart. And I keep seeing that because, like, if one person has like a moral failure, and then it's like, what do you do? How do you keep the machine going? Like, oftentimes it like dwindles, right? Or the church like will close down or something. And then you see, that leader a couple years down the road reinvent themselves and whatever, and then repeat the cycle all over again. And I was like, well, how do we stop that? I think we need to have flat leadership that has accountability to each other and that has that same like respect and authority to each other, rather than just having it in one person. I don't know. I feel like that would help us out so much more. And the president has like a ton of people who are in their cabinet, right? Not whether he listens to them or not, I don't know. But there's all these peoples, and there's all these like checks and balances in place so that one person doesn't amass all this power and it becomes like a dictator, which I think happens a lot in churches, even though we don't call it that. But in other ways, that's just essentially what it becomes.
You know what's interesting though? Like the government structure we have, like people don't understand it's not a democracy, it's a republic, like we elect leaders.
Yeah.
And the only power the president has is to veto.
Yeah.
That's his really only power.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
really can't do anything else without
Yeah.
like the work of Congress and the
Yeah.
Senate and stuff.
Yeah.
So one last thing is like just to encourage you, I'm in the camp of like it's. I think it's because we're in like the 99.9 percentile of the end times, and
Hmm.
like the whole prophecy of Joel of like sons and daughters prophesying, and I think that's why women are stepping up because it's like we need them to. So
Hmm.
I'm totally with you, and I love what you're doing with like children and families because at the end of the day, I think we've forgotten church was supposed to be a collective of families,
Hmm.
not just this like machine. Yeah. Okay, I have
Yeah.
one last question.
Yeah.
What is that painting behind you?
Oh, this is by my friend Shin Meng, and it's basically like the Trinity, but it's called American Han. That's what it's titled. And he is living, I want to say he's living in Scotland right now because his wife is doing a graduate program out there. I call him like a modern icon painter, but he does like a lot of digital work. And so, yeah, this is one of my favorite things that he's done, American Han. But I also feels like it's like God, Jesus, like Holy Spirit, but it's also like the generations of, that Korean term of Han, like being like passed down. And so, yeah, it just spoke to me a lot, especially during COVID. It was a painting that was really meaningful for me. It was a hard time. And and I think I just leave it up there to remind me that we may have this Han, but God's grace and love is also there too. And so that is what heals, because Han is just like that stuffed in, unrequited, like it's like you're bearing it all on your own, but actually God is there to bear that with us. We can share that with him. So yeah,
That's good. That's a good way to
yeah,
end the podcast.
yeah,
Well, thanks for coming on.
yeah. Thanks so much, Danny. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, that's it for the podcast. Bye, guys.
Bye.